Okay, take two. Thank you for coming out this evening. Tonight we're going to be talking about NgRx and testing using Jest and marbles. My name is Brian Love. You can follow me on Twitter at Brian_Love. As Carlos mentioned, I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies. And just to give you a little bit about who I am, perhaps, I'm from upstate New York. And so when I say New York, I'm not talking about the island that's down on the bottom right that probably most of you think about when you hear the words New York. There's actually an entire, what we call, state, and I'm from basically the middle of nowhere in New York. I don't live there anymore, though. That's where I grew up, and it was a very nice place to grow up. But I now live in Denver, Colorado, which is also a very nice place to live. And we've got great mountains and skiing like you do here as well. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about NgRx and Jest. So the first thing you might be asking yourself is like, okay, well, why are we using Jest and not Karma? And you can use Karma with a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about this evening. So if you're using Karma today and you're not looking to get off of that and you got a lot of tests written in Karma, that's fine. I do want to introduce you to Jest if you've never heard of it as well, and that's what we're going to be primarily using on some of the code tonight. So the biggest reason why I use Jest is because it's wicked fast. So I don't know what your experience has been with Karma. I work with clients in Denver, what we call the Front Range, which is kind of the area along the Rocky Mountains. And we've got some clients that have lots of tests. And lots of applications. And when I say lots of tests, I'm talking like 2, 5, 10,000 unit tests. And when they put this in their CI pipeline, it takes like 20 minutes to run all these tests, right? So you do a PR, you got to sit there for 20 minutes while it's running the tests. And one of the reasons is because of Karma, and even if you're using headless Chrome, it's still quite slow, or can be slow. And so there's a couple of reasons why Jest is fast. Jest uses a technology called JS DOM, so it doesn't actually use a browser at all. It mocks out the entire DOM using this open source library called JS DOM. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to execute tests in parallel, right? So instead of each test going in series, we could actually run, spawn out multiple tests at the same time and run them all in parallel. So we can run our tests really fast. If you're using Jest, there's no need for Karma anymore. And the nice thing about Jest is it has a Jasmine-like API. So a lot of the way you set up your tests and the way you do your tests are very similar to Jasmine. There are some minor differences in the API, and you might notice that if you're using Jasmine today. We will be using Angular Jest preset. This is a preset for Jest that allows us to configure Jest for Angular very easily. So how do you get started with Jest? It's pretty easy. We're going to just npm, you can use yarn as well, and install Jest as well as the Jest preset Angular package. The next thing we need to do is we need to configure Jest. So we'll wire up a jest.config.js file. We will point to the preset, the root of our application where we're testing, so the source directory. And then we're also going to give it this setup files after env. And so after the environment is set up in Jest, this file is going to be executed before your tests in order to do anything that you need to kind of customize. So like I mentioned, we're using JS DOM, or Jest is using JS DOM. JS DOM, for whatever reason, doesn't mock out every single API in the DOM. So there's a couple of very minor things that you might have to actually mock out in the DOM yourself. And you can find tutorials online to do that. It's pretty common. And when I say it doesn't mock out everything, it mocks out like 99%. So there's just a very small amount that you might have to, an edge case, if you will, that you'll have to deal with. And then inside that setup test, we'll go ahead and import our preset. And then that's that global mocks that you might have to have in order to do some additional mocking. Okay, so that's a little bit about Jest and why you might consider using it. So let's dive into NgRx. And like I mentioned, we're not going to be doing like an introduction to NgRx, but very briefly, let's just talk quickly about the NgRx store architecture. Right? So we know that we have actions. Actions are simply an object that have a type property, that's a string, right? String constant, if you will, that are dispatched. We know that we have a reducer. It's a pure function that's going to mutate the state of our store. We have selectors that are memo-wise, so that's a caching methodology that allows us to get access to data that's in the store. And then we have effects, and effects allow us to perform side effects for actions that we're dispatching. If you're following along, or if you watch this video later and you're kind of curious about digging in a little deeper, feel free to clone out this repo that I've got. So it's github.com, blove is my username, and then the repository is called NgRx-testing. And I'm going to be using that this evening and showing you some code from that repository. And you can go home and say, I kind of didn't understand how to do that, or I want to, you can copy paste code right out of there. It's totally free and open, and you can use that as some examples for your projects and your organization. Okay, let's do a quick demo actually. Let me switch over. And I'm going to need to bump this up, I suspect. Good? Yep. Good? Let's just hide that for now. Okay, you can say I ran this at the hotel just to make sure that everything still passed. Didn't want any red when I got up here. So let's go ahead and we're just going to run that. And that's going to invoke, I've got a script that's running Jest, and we're going to see here it's going to run all these tests. And you can see it ran 56 tests in about 4 seconds. That's pretty fast. We didn't have to start up Chrome or anything. Boom, done. And these are testing modules, components, NgRx actions, effects, reducers, kind of everything. So certainly this is a good place to kind of take a look if you're curious about testing with NgRx. Use this as a sample. All right, so let's dive into actions. So do we test actions? You might be asking yourself. I've had some discussions with some of the people that are kind of my peers in Colorado and United States that are Angular developers. And a lot of people are like, well, do I really need to test actions? In this, your mileage kind of may vary for this. And you're going to see that we're going to test the implementation of our actions. You really don't need to test actions, at least in my opinion. They're just classes and objects. There's really nothing there to test, right? I mean, so just kind of, we're going to step right over those and get into the good stuff. But we will circle back around and actually test dispatching of actions and make sure we're spying on those in our components. Okay, so let's get into reducers. So what we want to do with our reducers is we want to basically assert a couple of different things. We want to assert that no state mutation happens for an invalid action. So kind of a no-op action. So it's very easy to do. Then we want to assert for state mutations for all of our valid actions. And we're going to test that all those actions result in the desired state change. Here's an example of asserting what I call a no-op, or just kind of it's just a test. It's not supposed to do anything. So what we're going to do here first is we're just going to create an action. I'm not even going to new anything up like you might see in TypeScript. I'm just going to set this to an object, give it a type of no-op, set it to any because who cares. And then I'm going to invoke the reducer, so that's imported up above. I'm going to have undefined as my initial state, so that's that first argument into our reducer function. And then provide it the action, which is the second argument into that function. And we're just going to expect that the result is going to be just that initial state, right, that we imported from our NgRx reducer function. Excuse me, reducer file. Oh. So now we're actually going to get into testing, adding a dispatching of actions. So what we want to do, let me switch over and just show you this add user real quick. So if we take a look, here's add user in our enum. It's got a string constant, nothing special here. If we go down, here's add user. It's got a payload of a partial of a user. And then when that user is successfully created or added, then we're going to dispatch the add user success action. And again, this time it gets a payload. Instead of a partial, it's the full user object this time. And then I've also got an add user fail action. Again, here's the payload, and we're just going to receive a generic error. And if I come into the reducer, let's see, where's add user? Yep, so here for the add user action, all we're going to do is we're going to return our spreaded state. We're going to toggle a loading Boolean variable, in this case, from false to true, and make sure that error is set to undefined. And when a user is successfully added, we're going to use, in this case, I'm using NgRx entity, so I'm going to invoke the add1 method on the adapter. I'm going to provide it that user object that I'm adding into the store, or into that collection, if you will, and then I'm toggling loaded to false. If we look at the add user file, simply going to spread state, and then we're going to provide the error into our store and toggle loading to false as well. So just so you kind of see the pattern that we're going to be testing. So in order to test this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to new up our add user class and provide, in this case, I'm not showing you every line of code, but user is partial of a user object that's generated for the test. Result is going to be what comes out of our reducer. So we're going to invoke the reducer, provide it the initial state. Again, we're importing that, as well as the action. In this case, it's a real action instead of the no op that you saw previously. And then we're going to expect our result to equal exactly what we saw in that reducer, right? So here's our initial state. We're going to spread that. Oops. The initial state, error is supposed to be undefined, and loading has been set to true. So pretty easy to test our reducer function. There's not a lot of magic here. The same is true for add user success. We're going to new up our add user success action. We're going to invoke our reducer with our initial state and the action that's going to be mutating our state. And we're going to expect that our state that comes back is the initial state, plus we've got our entities. So if you're familiar with the NgRx entity library and the way it stores collections, it stores collections in two properties for each entity collection. It's got a dictionary, or an object, if you will, of entities, which are ID based as the property, or the key, if you will, and then the value of that object property. And then dictionaries and objects, as you probably know, are not ordered, or order is not guaranteed in JavaScript. And so in order to maintain order of the objects in our collection, the NgRx entity stores those IDs in an array. And so we'll be able to use that to kind of look them back up and get them in the proper order. So this is what we expect when add user success is the reducer modifies the state of our application. So we've got our entities. It's going to add on this new entity, the ID of Anakin, it's a Star Wars thing, and then the actual object, the user Anakin, and then we also add the ID into that IDs array, and we set loading to false. Again, this pattern is very familiar, I think. Now we're starting to see this. In this case, we're going to test the add user fail. So we're going to new up an error, not provide anything. We don't really have to. I suppose we could. We're going to new up our add user fail action, providing that error payload. And then we're going to invoke our reducer, providing the initial state and the action. And then we're going to simply expect that the result is that initial state with the error now stored in the state of the application. So pretty easy to test our reducers. I don't think there's any complexity there. Once we get into doing effects, you're going to see it's a little bit trickier. So, all right, good. So as I was kind of talking, I'm using NgRx entity. You may or may not be. If you are, you might also be asking yourself at this point, okay, well, do I really need to test everything with the entity collection, that it's mutating the state for me in the adapter? Probably not necessary. It might affect your code coverage, so if that's something that's mandated to your organization, be aware of that. I will say it's a bit tedious. I have written tests for NgRx entity, and it's quite complex and tedious, especially when it gets into adding many and updating many and some of the other methods that are available on the adapter. If you'd like to dive into it, check out the code. Like I mentioned, you can go to this user-reducer.spec.ts file. I can switch over to it. We can take a look at it if you want. Just close that. So here's our add user success and fail. And these are all pretty easy, but if I scroll down into like this one, for example. So this is updating a user, and it actually becomes quite, I would say trivial, but also very long and really kind of not important to write this test. Right, so this is 188 to 223, so it's like 40, 50 lines of code just to test updating a specific entity in the collection. I will say that NgRx entity has its own tests, so you're probably covered there. So don't feel like you need to test every little bit of that application or of what that's doing to your state. All right, good. So that's we talked about actions, we talked about reducers. So now we're going to get into effects, which is kind of where the meat of this presentation is. Before we get into that, though, how many people know what the difference is between a hot and cold observable? I got a few hands. Okay, so we need to know that in order to do this, because we're going to use functions cold and hot, which are going to create mocked observable streams for us. So let's quickly dive into this. I will say I'm going to do this pretty briefly. You can certainly find more information online. Ben, who's one of the primary authors for RxJS and on the core team, has a great article you can check out on his, I think, Medium account, where he really goes into what are hot, what are cold observables, why, and these kinds of things. But to summarize, a hot observable is an observable that closes over the producer, right? And so the producer is always producing whether or not there are subscribers. So I kind of use this example. Maybe to kind of illustrate this, let's say my wife is the producer and she's talking, right? And let's say, she's in the kitchen talking, but I'm like in the other room and I can't hear her. I'm not listening, I'm not subscribed to her, right? But she's just over there talking, right? Now when I walk into the room, I can hear her and I'm subscribing and I'm receiving those notifications now, right? If you will, on an observable stream of data. But the fact that I'm in the room or out of the room doesn't affect the fact that she's over there talking, right? I will say, as a quick joke, I've told my wife that I use this metaphor when I talk about hot and cold observables. And I don't know if I can exactly quote her, but she basically said, well, as long as you said I'm hot, that's fine. So I have her permission to use this example. So there you have it. So that's a hot observable, right? It's maybe a socket it's producing values, but once I subscribe to a chat or something like that, now I'm starting to actually receive those notifications. So it's producing whether or not there are subscribers. On the other hand, a cold observable is probably more like what normal people are. My wife probably doesn't just talk to herself for no reason in the kitchen or in the other room. It's only when I actually walk into the other room that she's like, oh, you're here. Let me now tell you something. Let me talk to you, right? And so a cold observable, the producer only produces values when when there's one or more subscribers to that observable stream, right? So think about in Angular, we know that a perfect example is the HTTP client. It's only when you subscribe to HTTP client's observable that it returns that it will actually issue the request, right? It doesn't issue the request until you subscribe. So in Angular, HTTP client returns cold observables. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. Let's dive into effects. So there's a couple things we're going to need to do to test our effects. We're going to need to mock out the actions. That's a hot observable. So we're going to need to mock out the actions. So whether or not you're subscribed or listening in an effect to an action, actions are always being dispatched, right? So the producer is producing no matter what, right? So we need to mock that out because we're not going to actually want to be dispatching hot or observable actions. The next thing we want to do is we're going to mock out the HTTP client observables. So in most of my examples for testing NgRx effects, I'm dispatching a request using HTTP client. So we're going to need to mock that out as well because we don't want to actually make requests when we're testing. We'll also need to mock and test those dispatch actions. And we're also going to want to mock and test any sort of error handling using perhaps the catch error RxJS operator. So sounds pretty easy, right? I mean, all we got to do is mock these observable streams of actions. I mean, they're asynchronous. We'll just have to kind of figure that out, right? Yeah, so it's kind of hard if you try to do it without marbles. I would suggest you probably not even try. So what we're going to be using is a package called Jasmine Marbles. This code is actually created by Brandon Roberts and Mike Ryan, who are kind of the core contributors or one of the core contributors to NgRx. They wrote this library. And I think there's also a Jest marbles that you can use that came out more recently. And that'll work a little bit better with Jest, but you can use Jasmine marbles with Karma or with Jest. So how do we get started? Obviously, we're going to need to install it. So let's use npm or yarn and install that dependency of Jasmine marbles. And marbles testing provides a couple of things for us. So it provides a simple way to describe our observable streams. It allows us to mock out these observables and these subscriptions. Behind the scenes, it uses what's called a scheduler in order to do this. And each character in our marble is going to be 10 frames. And this is kind of a virtual frame. And we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail. How many people are familiar with these marble diagrams? Seen them? Yes, good. All right. I'll quickly review it just so you can see. Basically, here is our observable stream. Our observable stream is emitting what are called next notifications or values. In this case, 4, 6, letter A, 8. And then this pipe denotes a completion of that stream. So the stream is now complete at this point. And then we're going to, in this diagram, we're kind of doing a multiply by 10 would be the operator that's performing on these next notifications. So 4 becomes 40, 6 becomes 60. And then here in this example, they've got an X, and this represents an error because I can't multiply A by 10, right? And so this throws an error, and that error is emitted by the observable stream. So with that in mind, we're going to use a string syntax to kind of represent both time and values emitted over time in our observable stream in our marble testing. So let's kind of run through these real quickly. So a dash, that's going to represent the passage of time. That's roughly 10 frames of time. The pipe, as we saw previously in the marble diagram, was our completion notification. So a pipe in the string syntax will represent a completion notification. The pound sign or the hash symbol, whatever you want to refer to it as, that indicates an error has been emitted in the stream. The caret symbol, that indicates a subscription point in a hot observable. And then any character, so A through Z, indicates a next value. And you will see that here shortly. And then if we've got multiple, say a value and a completion notification occurs at the exact same time, we have to group those together, and we'll do that using parentheses. So let's take a look at a couple examples before we actually get into the effects. So that way we can kind of learn the marble syntax. So here we can see our dash represents this passage of 10 frames. We've got the letter A, that's an emitted value. And then we've got a pipe. So the observable here, this is a cold observable that I'm creating. So there's two functions with Jasmine marbles that you'll use, cold and hot. Cold will create a cold observable, and this represents an observable that is going to, after 20 frames, emit a value. It'll wait 20 more frames and then emit a completion notification, right? So we're kind of mocking out time. Here's another example. The only difference here is instead of a completion notification, we're going to get an error notification at the end, right? So 20 frames pass, we get a value or a next notification. 20 frames pass, and then we get an error notification. Of course, observable streams can emit multiple values. So in this instance, we've got 20 frames of time have passed. We get a value next, so we get a value. 10 frames pass, we get another value, so different value. 20 frames pass, and then we get a completion notification. Okay. Yes, sir.
You say that over the slide before say that the carrot work only with hot observable.
Correct.
Why is the reason?
Yep.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, so the question is, why do we have this subscription point in a hot observable, right? Because remember, hot observables can be, we can represent in a marble diagram that values are getting produced, and then we've got a subscription, and then more values are being produced. Because remember, in a hot observable, we can have values produced without a subscription. In a cold observable, there is no such thing as values being produced until somebody subscribes. So there's no reason for having a subscription point in a cold observable stream. Clear? Yeah, cool. Good question, thank you. Okay, so let's take a look at an effect. Your effects might be slightly different. This is kind of how I do things, and I've kind of learned and observed how people are doing this. You may be doing it slightly different, but here's an example of that add user that we've kind of been talking about, right? So I dispatch this add user. I've got an effect, and this is the effect here, that's going to, when that add user is dispatched, is going to use the user service to invoke the add user method on the user service, so down here. And then it will, when that comes back, we'll then call or dispatch add user success, and we'll catch an error and dispatch add user fail. So it's important to note that we're using exhaust map, so that's going to switch the observable streams from the actions observable stream that I'm listening to here. So I'm filtering it by the type of add user. I'm going to just pluck out the payload using the map. Using exhaust map, I'm going to get that payload. I'm going to send that off to my user service. And then I'm going to use map again to map to a new action that's going to be returned back to our NgRx store that's going to be dispatched for me by the effect, and that's the add user success. Oop, I thought I had one more. And then we have that catch error like I mentioned about on the bottom. Yes, sir.
So exhaust map, that's like ignores every other stream, also every other request until the first one finishes, yes?
Correct. So exhaust map will not allow additional input observables until the inner observable completes.
But does it wait for them or throws them away?
It throws them away. Exhaust map throws them away.
Okay.
Yep. There's another one that might wait. Switch map will actually just keep going. Right. So let's say I've got a bug in my code and I dispatch add user twice for whatever, or let's say the user double clicks and I'm not preventing it, right? You know, they click add, then they click add again because they're impatient. What will happen with exhaust map, the first add user action will come in here, and then it's only until this observable stream that's returned by the user service. Once that actually issues a completion notification, then it will kind of keep going. If another action is dispatched into this pipe, the exhaust map will just throw it away until the inner observable completes.
Thank you.
Yep. So how do we test this? So this is where we're going to kind of get into, it gets a little bit fun, honestly. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to just generate, I've got this like helper function, if you will, called generate user. It's just going to create a mock user for me. You could be using Faker or some other library or whatever you want in order to generate out just dummy code or objects. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to new up our action. We kind of saw this previously. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have an outcome, and this is going to be our add user success. This is what I'm going to be testing for, I'm going to be expecting. Next, I want to set my actions observable stream. So this is the actions observable stream in NgRx. And so I'm going to provide this mock, and I'm going to provide a hot observable stream because the observable stream, the actions observable stream in NgRx is a hot observable stream. So I'll use the hot function. And I could really do like whatever I want here. I could have several dashes or whatever, but keep in mind right now for my test, I've got a single dash, so that's 10 frames. So time has passed. And then I've got the string or the character A. The second argument to the hot function is where I can actually tell the observable, the mock, if you will, what value to actually put in those placeholders, right? So in this instance, I'm going to say create an observable stream that after 10 frames emits a value that is this action, which is the add user. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of mocking out the NgRx action stream, right? And I'm saying after some time, the add user action is dispatched. In the next line, we're going to have a constant called response. And in this case, we're going to use the cold function. And then in here, after 10 frames has passed, I'm going to emit a value followed by a completion notification. And that value that we are expecting to emit is going to be the user that I generated up here. Next, we're going to create another cold observable stream. This is going to be after 20 frames, so there's 2 dashes, we are going to get a value. And that value is the outcome, which is the add user success action. And so it's kind of important to know some of these timing things, right? Because we're mocking time, right? And so 10 frames goes by, an action is dispatched, 10 frames goes by, another action is dispatched, and then completion, right? And so what we need to do is we need to actually have 2 dashes here. That's why there's 2, because after the 2 frames is when we actually expect that our add user success is dispatched.
Sorry, but in the before you, it was like 10 frames for each characters, right?
For each dash.
Oh,
Yeah. So that's why I've got 2 here. So there's 2 ticks here because I'm going to expect that this outcome, which is the add user success, is going to be dispatched after 20 frames. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to actually, in my user service, I'm going to override that add user method because I don't want to actually invoke that method in my effect. So in this case, we're going to just use jest.fn, which is just a mock function, and I'm going to provide it a fat arrow function here that returns our response. That is that cold observable that's coming out of the HTTP client, if you will, right? Because remember, HTTP client does cold observables. And then finally, I'm going to expect that in my effects, the add user is going to be this observable, which is the expected observable stream. And that's what's going to actually come out of the effect and is going to be dispatched at the end, right? So that lines up with the fact that at the end, I'm going to get this expected outcome. So that's the success path. Now what we want to do is we want to switch over and we want to test our failure path. So this is very similar. We're going to generate out a user. We're going to new up our add user action. I'm going to create a new error as well. I'm going to new up the add user fail and provide it that payload, that error that I created. And now in this case, what we're going to do is our actions observable stream that we're mocking in NgRx is hot, just like it was before. And after 10 frames, it's going to emit this action, which is the add user action, just like we had before. But now the response is a cold observable that after 10 frames emits an error notification rather than a value, followed by a completion notification. So it's going to go 10 frames, error, and then complete. And the cold observable function, we're not providing any values here because I don't have any characters. So we're just going to leave that. It probably could be null rather than an object. And then we're going to actually provide that error that is going to be emitted by the observable stream. And then here we're going to expect that the outcome of our actions effect is after 20 frames, we're going to get a value B, which is the outcome, which is our add user fail action, along with the completion notification. And that's going to happen at the exact same time. And so we put the parentheses around it to kind of group that together. You got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that cold observables don't really produce anything until they're subscribed to. Can you repeat the question?
Yep.
And in this question, the response object is a cold observable, but where is it actually subscribed to? Is that somewhere magic in the framework, or?
So the question is The response is a cold observable stream, and where is it being subscribed to? Is that the question? Let me think about that. So the cold observable stream, so response is what is coming out of add user, right? And so where does that get subscribed to? Let's go back and take a look. So this is going to return that cold observable. And the whole this whole observable is subscribed to by NgRx. And I'm pretty sure because I've got this in a switch map, that the exhaust map, that it'll actually kind of, I don't know, does it subscribe? I guess. To that inner observable, yeah? Yeah. So this is the inner observable that it'll subscribe to, and then whatever observable that comes out of that kind of goes into the next part of the pipe. Do I have that right? Confirmed GDEs, yes? Yeah. Yeah, sure.
This method you mocked out in the test, so it's not going to this exhaust map. Repeat.
Oh. So I think the question is it's being mocked out, so it's actually not going into the exhaust map. It is, I'm overriding this property here, the method. Yeah? I think, yeah. Good questions, guys. I love it. Okay, so did we finish this? Yes. So we talked about the expected. So after 20 frames, we're going to get our outcome, which is the add user fail, that action, followed by or along with a completion notification at the same time. So that's why we use the parentheses to group those together. And then here is where I'm overriding that property, or excuse me, that method in the user service. And I'm just setting that to a mock function that's returning our response, which is that cold observable that's coming out. We're mocking that cold observable that comes out of the HTTP client.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Jean.
The assertion additions to be observable.
Correct.
Is that coming automatically from
Yes.
Jasmine?
So that's Jasmine Marbles is adding that onto it. Yes, that's correct. So this is not there when you use Jasmine, right? So it's adding that on to the prototype. Good question. Good. And I think actually that's one of the things maybe I ran into, I'll have to remember, but when you first kind of get into this, TypeScript kind of yells at you about this. And I think you have to like maybe they fixed it, maybe that was a while ago, but you used to have to like override the namespace and say, oh no, the effect, this actually has a to be observable, that you can invoke that's going to accept an observable. So you got to provide the TypeScript declaration, but they may have fixed that since then. So good. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, awesome. All right, so let's get into selectors. So now that we've tested, we didn't really need to test our actions. We're going to test those when we actually get into the implementation detail. We tested our reducers. We've installed Jasmine Marbles. We're using Jest. Although, as you saw previously in this slide, there's not a whole lot to this that's actually using Jest other than this mock function. I mean, you could easily switch that out with Jasmine, right? So now let's get into testing our selectors. So let's take a look at some selectors that are in the sample code that the repository that you're welcome to take a look at. Here's a method. This is just a projector function that's going to accept the state and return out a property within that state object, the selected user ID. Here I'm going to actually create a selector using the create selector function. This is going to have the user state, so that's the entire user state that's going to be returned there, or that's a selector. And then I'm going to use that projector function to actually pluck out the selected user ID from the state. And then here, I'm just going to, instead of selected user ID, this is just selected user, so it's fairly similar. In this case, I'm going to get the entities. So instead of the whole state object, I'm going to get that entities dictionary that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier with NgRx effects, or with NgRx entity adapter. So in this case, I'm going to get that entities dictionary that has all of my objects that are stored in my collection. And then I'm going to use this selector to get the selected user ID. And then I'm going to use a projector function here that accepts both the entities and the ID. And it's going to go ahead and pluck out that object from the dictionary. Right? So fairly standard selectors that you might be using with NgRx. Okay, so let's look at how we actually test this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of setup. I had to just split these up into a couple slides. So let's go ahead and generate out some users. In this case, I'm going to generate out 2 users. I'm going to create an entities dictionary with our user ID as the property, and then each user object. And then I'm going to have the selected user is going to be the first user, right? So kind of keep that in mind as we get into the rest of this test. So the first thing we want to do is we want to verify that we get null entries. I think I'm missing an E there. We should return null entries when the entities is a falsy value, right? So when we have no entities, when it's null or whatever. So we're going to expect in this case that for our selected user, we're going to invoke the projector on selected user. And we're going to just expect here, we're going to provide null, and then along with the ID. And all we're doing here is we're just asserting that, hey, if I don't have any entities, when I select the selected user, I should just get null, right? So we're just kind of verifying that. But then here's where we actually want to test that we're retrieving the selected user. So when I've actually got a selected ID in NgRx and I've got my entities collection, here, I'm going to actually use that selected user, invoke that projector as well. And this time, I'm going to provide that entities that we saw a couple slides ago, right, that dictionary. And then I'm also going to provide it with that ID. And now we're going to assert that I actually get the selected user out of that entities collection. All right, good. So let's talk about implementation now. Let's dive into the kind of the last little bit here. So what we want to do is we're going to spy on the dispatch. We want to make sure in our components that we're actually dispatching the right actions. We want to invoke that manually via the component, and then we want to assert that specific actions were actually dispatched. So, all right. So here, I'm describing this is in the ng on init, and I'm basically saying that it should dispatch select user action for the specified ID parameter. And we're going to new up that select user action. So we're going to actually select a user. And all that's going to do is just keep track of the ID in the NgRx store. And then I'm going to create a spy. You can do this with Jasmine. This is the Jest syntax. So I'm going to use jest.spyon. And I'm going to spy on the store, and I'm going to spy on that dispatch method. And I'm simply going to expect that the spy has been called with the appropriate action. In this instance, we want to just assert that we're dispatching the load user action. So after we've selected it, we want to go ahead and then load it perhaps. So in this case, all we're going to do is new up the load user. We're going to provide that same ID value like we did earlier. We'll spy on dispatch, and then we're going to just expect that that spy has been called with the appropriate action. Cool. And that's testing Jest with marbles. So thank you very much. If you guys have any questions or any more questions, I'd love to hear. So, yeah, go ahead.
What emoji was this square?
It's a bug. You will never know. I think it was supposed to be a unicorn.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for the presentation.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? I'm happy to chat afterwards too, or.
I have a question about time frame that you were working with. So in the presentation, you show like 2 time frames for response and expected. What if we have more? So what if we have like scheduled time or like more, like 40 or 50?
I mean, you're just, yeah, so the question is what if we have more time? Like, This seems, perhaps you might say, the time that I've chosen seems arbitrary here, right? And in fact it is, because it's a test, right? I mean, I could have mocked this out and said, okay, well the hot observable, it's actually, let's see. This is in add user. Let's go over into the code and kind of play around a little bit. So like in this instance here, so I'm kind of mocking out this 10 frames and 10 frames and 20 frames, right? I think that's what your question is around. You can see here I'm getting that to be observable thing. Maybe I didn't do it in this project. Anyways, yeah, I mean this could have been that amount of time, right? And this one is this amount of time, right? Or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter because I guess I'm kind of playing God here, right? I'm telling it time. I'm describing time, right? And so however much time it is, I just need to make sure that these kind of line up in the end, because otherwise my expected, so if I leave that there and I say that after 20 frames, I'm expecting an outcome, that's not going to be the case. Because after 20 frames, I haven't even dispatched an action, right? So let's just try that real quick. Have a little fun here. I mean, it's going to fail, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully, otherwise I'm going to be like, oh man, what? All right, so it failed. All right, so that's good, right? And it's going to say here, right? It's going to say expected value to equal, but I actually received this. It wasn't until after 70 frames that I got the notification, but I'm telling it that it was supposed to happen after 20 frames. Does that kind of help answer your question? Like, I mean, truly, like you are describing time, right? I mean, so that's one of the things that's really kind of, in my mind, kind of cool about Jasmine Marbles is we're writing synchronous code to test asynchronicity, right? So we're testing asynchronous code, but we're mocking time. We're mocking this idea of asynchronous code out using this marble-like string syntax. I'm going to change that back so that way I don't forget. All right,
So the
good.
items that are getting sent through the streams are synchronous.
Yes, because it's using, so the question is, thank you, he's very good about reminding me, repeat the question, please. So the items are synchronous is the question, or are they synchronous? Yes. And I don't claim to be like an Uber RxJS. I mean, Ben Lesh knows, I mean, he wrote it, obviously, so there's people out there that know RxJS way better than me, but behind the scenes, it's actually using the scheduler API, right? So there's a class, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Jean, but there's a class called scheduler in RxJS that you can actually use, and that's what RxJS Marbles is using, or Jasmine Marbles, excuse me, in order to kind of create this synchronous time, series of events. At least that's my understanding. So, cool. I love the questions, guys. Keep them coming. We're gonna hang out. Let's do it.
To stay with the timing topic, what if you
Yeah.
really have a time component in your effect, let's say a debounce or
Ooh.
maybe even a timeout or something?
Question. The question is what if you already have a timing operator or effect, if you will, inside of the effect that's already doing something with time? I don't know if I know the answer to that question, to be honest. I appreciate that. Let's try it real quick. Let's see what happens.
It's a very good question.
It is a very good question. So let's say I'm debouncing. Let's go to that add user. Isn't that the one?
Delay.
Yeah, because
Or a delay of so many milliseconds. Yeah, it wouldn't be debounce, because then debounce, we'd have to dispatch the action multiple times in order to, well, it would delay, I mean, yeah. But let's throw delay in.
Easier, yeah. It's like what is it?
So it needs to be asynchronous, or it overrides the operators. One of these. Otherwise.
Okay, so here's my add user effect. Let me kind of move this down a little. And let's go ahead and throw in a delay. Hopefully that got imported from the right place. No, it did not. Where did it bring delay? From Q. We want that. Just use what? WebStorm? Is that what I heard? You know, it's funny because I think as I just learned this, as a GDE, we get a free license to JetBrains or something. So
Oh, really?
I have no excuse anymore to use. I mean, but VS Code's great, and the price is great as well. I mean, I kind of like both of those things. But you're right. I've used WebStorm when I had a previous client. They paid for it, and so yes, that was nice. Okay, so let's give this a try for your question. So we're going to throw a delay. We're going to delay this by 500 milliseconds. This is the add user. I changed that. I don't know what it's going to do. I mean, I hope it doesn't work. I hope it doesn't.
But I think in this case you need to add 500 dash in the expected time.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. I mean, that would sound logical actually.
That's a lot of dashes. Yeah, I gotta like copy paste like 10, 10, 10, 10.
Maybe just do array from and then length 50 map and then.
Yes, I like it. And just build out a string. So it expected to have a frame after 20 seconds, but it actually received nothing because of the delay.
Because
It was expecting too early.
Do you think Jest just timed it out or something? I mean, there's like a default like, but it's like 5,000 milliseconds. After 5 seconds, it'll like kill an unresponsive test or something like that, I think.
Will
Let's find it out.
the hot observable, will it just continue producing like nothing, just continuing when you don't provide a terminator?
You in the test, you mean if I don't provide this, the completion? Well, like in this hot observable, this action's observable. Like I'm mocking out a value of this stream, and it never completes. It just continues because it's a hot observable, right? But in this instance, my response here, remember the response is what I'm kind of telling. That's what's coming back from the HTTP client, if you will. I mean, that's what happens by Angular, right? And so the HTTP client, after some time, it gets a response. It either parses the JSON or whatever happens internally or whatever you kind of, and then it emits that next notification value and immediately completes. And that's actually a good point. Like you don't need to unsubscribe from an HTTP client observable stream because it's cold and it only emits a single value and then completes.
can you change the delay time to just do that 2 and try with 4 dashes for P for expected?
So supposedly
I could do this, watch. Well, we'd have to undo our effect.
So supposedly there is another syntax where you can make like write like 500 ms. So in that string, instead of dash, you can write like 500 ms
Oh,
and space.
let's try this. Dude, I love this. I'm learning something new. Sweet.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I guess I would never have would I never? I often wouldn't have a delay in an effect unless it's like, I mean, I love the question. I do. It's academic more than,
In the response probably after a dash, like you can do space
yeah.
and 500 ms and space, and also in the expected probably then.
And then it's going.
Yes, you're right.
No, it would be asynchronous, but like.
All right, so we've got our delay in here. This is good. This is better than live coding.
Let's try it.
Even let's try it. So we've got our delay of 500 milliseconds. And then Tomas is saying that if I use this 500 ms, so I'm going to still have a frame. The space must just be to give it a space, right? It's just going to kind of ignore that for time. But 10 frames, 500 milliseconds, value, completion, right? My hot observable, I'm still dispatching the action. Like time goes by, 10 frames, I'm dispatching the action. But my response here, I've got a delay on that. And then here's my expected. But I don't think I need it here, right, Tomas? Oh, he's not paying attention. I don't think we need it here, actually. Because this is the response of my HTTP client, if you will.
Yeah.
I need it here, because in my pipe, I've got this delay.
You're right. Yeah, you're right.
Let's try. Let's see what happens.
And the question is if it works also with Jasmine marbles because there's like RHS marbles. So let's see.
Yeah, it still got back an empty array.
Okay.
Maybe because the code is not asynchronous code.
Hmm.
Maybe you need to make it.
I mean, somehow you've got to mock out this time, this 500 millisecond delay that he's asking about. I mean, that's, yeah.
There are like RxJS marbles and then there are like just me marbles, like different FVM packages. So that's
Yes.
the question, like maybe they have different syntax in the different packages.
I tell you what, since you asked the question, if you would like to figure it out for us and then share it on Twitter or blog about it, I would love to read that article, honestly. It's a good question. I'm actually going to write it down because I want to look at it when I get home. What if we put a delay? How do we mock this out in the expected? Cool. Awesome. Man, I was bummed. I really was hoping that was going to work.
Yeah, I think it's a different package.
Yeah. All right, any other questions? In the back.
I still don't quite understand what it
See ya.
the definition of frames is in terms of servers. Or what does it mean?
Yeah, so the question is, what does frames mean? Why do we have this? Maybe why, it seems arbitrary perhaps, or why do we have this idea of frames? And all frames do is it's just a concept of time, right? You could say it's 10 ticks. You could say it's 10 milliseconds. You could put any kind of quantifier there, right? But it's representing time because observables are a stream of values, notifications over time. Yeah. So we've got to have this idea of time when we're dealing with asynchronous code or testing asynchronous code, right? And so that's why that just happens to be kind of what they came up with.
I guess in your test, it's just relevant that
it's this.
relative.
Look, this is a couple frames. That's a couple frames. A couple more. It's just time. It's no different than like in a marble diagram, right? I mean, clearly like A is dispatched after 6, and definitely longer time than this, right? But it's all kind of irrelevant. We're describing time.
The sequence, right?
It's just a sequence of things over time. Does that help to answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, it's clear now.
Okay, good. Yeah, sure.
Does it matter if you write in hot or cold? Because from the way it seems, it just starts at the same point, so it doesn't matter whether it's hot or cold.
Yeah, I mean, it really only matters when you actually get into testing. Repeat the question. So the question is does it matter whether we're using the hot function or the cold function? Because it seems like it doesn't. Is that a good way to reframe?
The starting point is the same.
The starting point is the same.
Time should be
That's
the same.
that's correct. Yeah. So I think I could have changed those from hot to cold and cold to hot, and the test would have been fine. Because I'm not testing any sort of subscription point. And that's just here at NgRx. If you're testing something else and you want to actually verify that a subscription happens at a certain point in time, then you would need to explicitly say it's a cold observable, and then you would be able to use that caret to identify the point in time that the subscription occurred.
So there is no syntax in your time frame where you can actually say that something subscribes to that particular observable stream.
Correct. I guess, we could try it. Like, let's go back to, so like this response stream. We should be able to put that there. That's basically denoting that there's a subscription point. Wait, hold on. Let's see if it works.
That's in a cold one, right? Subscription point in a cold one.
Oh, yeah. Good catch. Yeah. Yeah, but I can't really, there's no point in, I wouldn't, it would fail if I put it in hot, I believe, as well, because there is no subscription point to this hot observable stream, right? NgRx subscribes to that observable stream like when it first starts up, I think, right?
By definition, is meaningless.
Repeat the question.
No. By definition, it's
Sorry, I had a lot of fun with that. Say that again. He's like, no, he's done. It's meaningless to put it in here. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yes, this.
By definition.
Yeah, that's meaningless, right? Yeah, because there would be no values unless you subscribed, right? Yeah. So. Good. Any other questions? Yeah, yes. Oh, we got. Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
You always had a dash at the beginning.
Yes.
Is that for a special reason, or could you
No.
just also go ahead and stop it?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and back these off. I can just say that it immediately returns, like when you use the of operator, it immediately emits a notification value. There is no time, right? But like HTTP client, there's always time. Like our server, it's not immediate. It's not 0 milliseconds, right? So, I mean, that's kind of back to like his earlier question, like why 1 versus 3, or it's fairly arbitrary. We're just kind of mocking out time here. But if I drop that to 0 and 0, then that should work. Let's see. And now we're going to basically say this hot observable stream on frame 0 is going to emit this notification value. And then our response on frame 0 emits a notification value. And then on frame 10 or whatever on this, that subsequently then issues a completion notification. And we see everything pass now because these all line up, right? And so when we're doing this testing, because we're creating time, we also have to get the timing right? We can't have these kind of off, right? I mean, if I put here or whatever, this isn't going to work because now it's expecting that this timing isn't all lining up, and so this test should fail for us. Does that help? Yeah. But in general, I mean, the reason why I just go with 1 because I could have like 4, right? It's just easier because I'm saying after some time, then the action is dispatched. Maybe this represents when the browser is like loading a component and then ng on init is it going to dispatch on time 0? Like it's going to take some time and then ng on init fires, right? It's got to go through the life cycle of that component. So then that dispatch happens. Here, this is representing this time, it's 1, it could be 4 or whatever. This is the time that it takes until I get a response back from my server and then I actually get the value back in an HTTP client response. And then the expected, this is where I'm actually expecting that action to be dispatched, that success or failure action, and that has to kind of add up, right? Otherwise, that's where this one is not arbitrary. These 2 times are completely arbitrary. Oh yes, in the back.
Coming back to this 10 frames stands for 1 dash, or 1 dash stands for 10 frames. Why is this number 10? Is there a smaller
I don't know. So the question is, why? I knew you were going to. So the question is, and I don't know if I repeated his, I apologize. So the question is why 10 frames, right? I don't know. That's what they chose. It's just this idea of time. Like I was telling the other gentleman, we could call this 10 ticks, like of the CPU, which would not be 10 milliseconds. We could say 10 milliseconds, but then now we're actually quantifying time. So they just came up with this idea of frames. And probably 10 because like you Europeans, that's a lot smarter than like 12 inches. Or, do you want the King's version? The Imperial version? 10 probably made a lot of sense, maybe internal to the application to program it. You know what I mean? Then they could just multiply everything by 10. I'm not sure to answer your question. But it certainly makes a lot more sense than 12 inches in a foot. So, or how many feet in a mile? Does anybody know? 5,280. Why is that? I don't know, but that's what it is. Yeah, follow-on question.
just 1, that's my question. I mean, why it's not 1 if there is no possibility to slice it?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Like why not 1? I don't know. You could tweet at Mike Ryan and you could ask him. I'll ask him. We're on a GDE channel that we can ask each other questions. And I'll ask and say, hey, Why 10, man? I mean, was there the question that I think you're wanting is like, was there a specific reason that you actually chose this number rather than something? Why not 100? Why not? I get 10. Is it? Yeah. Why not 1? Yeah. Yeah.
In the future, he plans to have a semi-dash, right?
Oh yeah, like a half a dash, or this one's 5. And, I don't know. Good question. All right, cool. Any other questions? This has been great. Most of the meetups we go to, I don't get this many questions. People are just like, oh, that was good, I'm going home.
Swiss people are very curious.
I love it. Was there another one in the back? I thought he said I'm not Swiss. Okay.
You're the most curious all the
But, yeah, you seem pretty curious. You could be Swiss. All right, good. Any other questions? Good? Awesome. Dankeschön.